So start by adding 300 milliliters or 300 grams of warm water to a bowl. By warm I mean like 40 degrees. So hot water from the tap should be just about right. Then add about 6 grams of dry yeast. And you want to leave that for a few minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, until the yeast starts looking all blobby and disgusting. So while you're waiting for that, you can mix the flour. So we start off with weak flour. I don't know what it's actually called. You need 160 grams of that. And then you need to add the flour to a big bowl. The bowl has got to be pretty big because the dough is going to rise quite a lot. Next you need the strong flour. Again, I don't know what it's actually called, but in Japanese it's called strong flour. And you need 80 grams of that. Half as much as the weak flour. Or, 83. Finally, most important, whole wheat flour, which we need 120 grams of. So the last two dry ingredients are brown sugar, which you want about 10 grams of, and salt, which you need maybe 5 grams of. You can change the amount of salt depending on your personal preference, but I find 5 is about right. So we need to mix all the dry ingredients together. I find using a whisk makes it very easy. Once it's all uniform, then we're going to add the blobby yeast water mixture. And you can mix it all together with a fork. Make sure you get all the yeast off the sides of the bowl. You can mix it with a fork because it's pretty easy to mix. It's not very strong dough. And once it starts to look like this, you can use a scraper if you have one. And you don't need to do any kind of kneading. You just need to make sure the dry ingredients are all mixed in. And once it looks something like this and it's really sticky, then you can cover it and leave it for 1 hour. Now, just before we start working with the dough, it's useful to cover the surface with olive oil. You don't need to do this, but it just makes it a lot easier. And if you use good olive oil, it gives the bread a little extra nice flavor. Now, whenever you handle this dough, it's going to stick to everything. So it helps if you wet your hands and also wet the scraper. You probably need to do that, like every time you touch it, you'll need to wet your hands again. Luckily, you don't have to touch it that much. So to begin with, the dough will be very floppy and liquid, and you'll think, I can't possibly work with this. And you're right. So we're going to use the stretch and fold technique. And what this entails is grabbing a bit of the blob, stretching it, and folding it. And you do this on all 4 sides. And just sort of like a parcel, you wrap it up. So it should become vaguely square looking. And as soon as you do this, it'll start to sort of melt and unravel, so it's a good idea to turn it upside down. And once you've done that, cover with a bowl or something for maybe 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, it should have risen and be about twice the size. If it's not, then wait a bit longer. Do the stretch and fold technique again, and you're going to find that it's a lot easier to work with now. It's got more consistency and it's a bit more stretchy, and that's what the stretch and fold technique does. It just makes it more cohesive. So same thing, 4 stretch and folds to make a kind of square, and yeah, I'm not that good at this technique, as you can see. Turn it over, and leave it for another 20 minutes. Again, depending on the environment, you might have to leave it for longer, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Just depends on how fast the dough rises. The stretch and fold technique you should do maybe 3 or 4 times. Once the dough's nice and elastic, that's enough. You don't want to do it too much. And I find that just before we put it in the tin, we should do the first 2 sides with stretch and fold as before, but then we should kind of roll it up like this. It just makes it a bit easier to shape and pick up and put in the tin. Now, speaking of the tin, you can use baking paper to cover it, which is fine, but you can also just put it directly in the tin. But if you do that, you really need to cover the tin with olive oil or butter. And from my experience, you need quite a lot to stop it from sticking. And I think that doing it without the baking paper gives it a little bit more crispiness. So do the same stretchy foldy thing and roll it up, and then stick it into the tin. It should go in easily because it's all greased. And you should poke it, apparently. And the next rise should only take about 3 seconds. Magic! No, another 20 minutes or so, it should rise to about double the volume. And I like to put a bit of cornmeal on top. You don't have to do this, but I think it gives it a nice look and a nice flavor. And then you can slash it so that it doesn't get bulbous at one end or something when it bakes. Again, you don't have to slash it, but I find it works nice and it looks pretty. Bake it for 50 minutes at 210 degrees Celsius, and it's done.